Futures trading involves risk and is not suitable for all investors. Content provided in this segment is meant for educational purposes and is not a solicitation to buy or sell commodities.
Hi, it's Steve and Joe from Freshagenda, Ever.Ag's Global Insights team. And Steve, we're back this week with a bit of an update on the markets, as well as GDT 386, a little bit of an overview on European trade and, of course, Chart of the Week.
And as viewers can see, we're back in Melbourne, so we've got the usual stuff behind us and a much warmer room than we had last time.
So, SGX skim milk powder futures, just seen a little bit of weakness ahead of this week's GDT event, just start sliding down there. And a similar story on the EX. O'Neill tender was settled last week, mostly filled by European exporters, but at pretty close to domestic prices. So, not a lot of new news to move the market there, Steve. And just looking at spot markets for butter, cream and milk, cream actually lifted last week, which seems a little bit counter to the narrative that there's a lot more availability around. We have seen weekly data that France and Germany are starting to trend above year-ago levels. Milk spot prices are easing, but perhaps the weather, the very hot conditions that we've seen across Europe are playing a part here, Steve. They have receded this week, so it'll be interesting to see where the spot markets go.
Turning to butter, the butter picking up on that those threads, the EX butter market continued weaker despite what appears to be a stability in the short term for spot. Spot or official price trading around 7,000 euros a tonne, but actual trades are reported as lower. More milk coming, limited disease. I think that's what's playing into this, forward outlook here.
Yeah, and just looking at the over-the-counter market as well, just looking at the trades completed last week against the futures curve there, Steve, just still above what the futures contracts are suggesting there. So that market, the over-the-counter market, hasn't quite kept up with the weaker sentiment. And just looking across to the US now, cheese futures, the US remains pretty firm in the short term. Futures are just relaxing there through Q4 25. That's after weaker spot market last week. Spot clawed back up to $1.85 a pound, but still a bit of volatility there, Steve, as this new capacity comes on stream and hits the market.
Sure. Look at it, an interesting GDT result, which gave us a lower index by only 0.3%. So you call that flat, but that was helped by the heavy weight that whole milk powder plays in the index calculations. You can see there most of the bars are down. If you move into, skim, butterfats, cheese was mixed. Well, it was very small volumes there, of course, but yeah, quite a mixed event, Joe. I think you'd have to say the skim milk powder market was a bit weaker in line with what we've seen in those previous charts. And butterfat perhaps a little worried by the fact that there's more availability out of Europe. So EU fat certainly coming off. And we look at this slide comparing butter and cheese changes. In euro terms, butter's down 2.3% on average to 68.39 a tonne in euros. So as you say, trades are well below 7,000. Mozzarella also weaker in euro terms, trading down towards 3,900 euros a tonne, or in US terms, the lower end, looking at the Arla product, which is only $2.02 a pound. So that's, bringing back into perspective, may put a little bit more pressure on that, competing export selling price out of the US.
Sure.
We'll see.
Just looking at demand, and you can see here that whole milk powder demand was the only product where demand was stronger than average. All the other categories are a bit weaker there for this week.
And I've decided to save us from those forward curve or those curve charts on the demand over the event, Joe. They're not particularly interesting this week. Looking at whole milk, or ever, whole milk powder flattened out. The curve picked up towards the later period, so we've got an interesting development there. So later prices looking a bit stronger. The short term largely unchanged.
Yeah, and just looking at where that demand came from, in China, it was actually a lower percentage on a similar tonnage of whole milk powder sold at this event. And they've bought 28% less than a year ago, Steve. So not a whole lot of good news on the Chinese buying side.
No, there was a surge in those volumes. We thought, here we go. We are going to see some seasonal increases. No, we're going back to what it looked like 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And looking at Southeast Asia, similar to last year, but again, a bit lower this time around in terms of tonnages purchased by Southeast Asia. And what happens when other buyers step back? The Middle East comes forward. So the Middle East buyers have come in and helped lift that outcome, definitely. But as always, as soon as the prices are falling and other buyers are stepping back, we can see the Middle East buyers coming back into the fray. So
skim milk powder weaker in the short term as well. The later prices holding to where we got to last event. Not a lot of change there, but if you fan out the axis, it might look a little bit more dramatic. Prices converged between origins. First time since last October we've seen them this close together. So, heavier falls for the Fonterra products, mild changes for the Europeans at this event. There was a strong lift in Southeast Asian buying of skim leading up to this event, and it's continued. So we're going well above where we've been for several years here. Obviously, there's higher tonnage on the market through GDT now, but this is pretty encouraging. A higher percentage on a lower tonnage converted to more tons. China didn't help, though, and probably dragged this event lower because they really didn't turn up. Chinese buying weaker, well below the similar volumes of the last couple of years. And again, gosh, if this continues at these levels, we're going to see a pretty rugged time for skim milk powder sellers.
Yeah, and just looking at butter now, Fonterra unsalted butter, the forward butter curve is still backwardated, but a little bit flatter than it was just with those early contract periods, just a little bit lower with this event, Steve. And looking at that AMF discount to butter, it's narrowed a little with the heavier fall in C2 prices. And then looking at my other favourite chart of the whole milk versus the synthetic value of skim milk powder and AMF, still pretty tightly bunched there, Steve. Really a little bit stronger maybe in whole milk powder, but very close together these days. So where does that leave us?
So doing this same trick we did last time, showing where we were last week and this week. So both the EX and New Zealand prices have been weaker, GDT helping with that, and the US reasonably stable. The green line, they didn't change much.
And looking at butterfat comparisons last week and this week, not a lot of change really there, Steve. Just maybe a little bit softer in Europe, but not a whole lot of change otherwise.
So EU trade data came out, Joe.
Yeah, again, another mixed story. You can just see on the right-hand side in milk solids equivalent overall volumes were a little bit down for June, but skim milk powder exports actually were stronger, up 10% for the month of June and 5% for Q2 25 there. Best performance in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. Again, we've seen pretty good demand out of Southeast Asia for skim milk powder. But somehow fats have also improved, and that's mostly shipments to the US, Steve. The US consumers do love their Kerrygold butter, but as you mentioned, this is probably a lot to do with the fact that the tariff issues were still in the not settled at this point, and so a bit of bringing forward of shipments, no doubt.
And outside the US market, the butter exports out of Europe are pretty awful. It's the only region where there's growth at the moment.
Yes.
So cheese trade's always interesting. We did a bit of a take on how we saw US and New Zealand exporters faring in contestable markets last week. Here's how the EU shaped up after this week's trade data came out. And as predicted, I think we've forecast this. This latest month has really helped pull that down, because you look at the year-on-year changes there. This last month has been pretty average, really. It was flat before this. Now we see it well down. Cheese exports overall down 3.7% in June, up 1.2% in the first half of the year. So just hanging on, but quite weaker in those markets that matter. Worst in China, in the Middle East, and in South America in the first half. And really, the UK has been the strongest market for EU cheese, and a little bit of a revival in UK trade. It had been quite weak, but the last few months we've seen that really kick up.
Interesting.
Yeah. So charts of the week, Joe.
Yeah, I thought we'd bring it home, Steve. We just drove from halfway up the country to the bottom of the country over the weekend. And at the same time, Australian milk production numbers, which have been a bit delayed, came out to finish the season for 24-25. And overall, production was down to 8.32 billion litres. That's 0.7% down on the year before. But you can see it's just worsened over the last few months of the season. The month of June was down 6.4% nationally. But in southwest Victoria, Tasmania, and South Australia, lots of that orange bar below the line there, that's where those drought conditions have been extremely severe. And those regions are down over 4% for the season. So that's really, what we're looking at. But where do we go from here? Well, we got good news, Steve. Above average rainfall is forecast by the Bureau of Meteorology for most of eastern Australia. So that's a 60 to 80% chance of greater than median rainfall across the eastern half of Australia. And we do love to see that lovely blue colour, although it doesn't stretch right down into the bottom right-hand corner there where they desperately need it, but still better than we've had for the last 12 months or so.
I don't reckon I've ever seen that chart look like that.
It's pretty blue, isn't it?
Yeah, but just we've had La Niñas, El Niños and all that, but just to have that blanket across the East Coast, that's unusual. It means low feed prices, I guess, Jo.
Well, they will be coming. We have seen fodder prices just about topped out at very high levels in that drought-affected region. Part of that, Steve, might be just less demand because people just aren't prepared to pay those prices and they've shed some of their stock, as well as, signs that pasture's coming back. But the bad news, I guess, Steve, in terms of being able to take advantage of these improved conditions is what's happening with the cow herd. Now, we don't have comprehensive numbers yet, of course, but just looking at sale yard transactions over the last couple of months, you can see they've really ticked up in the last few months in terms of dairy cows heading to sale yards. And that really does reflect shortages of fodder on farm and high fodder prices, but also those very good beef prices that we're seeing in Australia at the moment. So, what happens to the herd is going to be critical in how milk production goes forward from here, even with those improved conditions, Steve.
Yeah, the words we've heard, Jo, talking around regions is it's hard to see that we could possibly get production to stay where it is. It's going to continue trending lower. That culling rate is, staying up there at levels we haven't seen for several years here. I mean, the prices will help that. But you go back to the second half of 22 when we had a pretty bad set of conditions running then. Are we into something like that? I think that's going to be interesting to watch for this market.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you for watching. We've provided some awesome blooper material before we've come to do this bit because we had some techno issues that really blew us away. You could see those, I'm sure, later in the year. We'll be back next week for the very last time doing this video. It is our swan song event, and don't miss it.